You know, when we did the video on the soul game Tokitoa, Time and Eternity, all that while back, I didn't actually think that I would actually end up spending like almost 2 months thereabout digging into trying to figure out more about what happened in the company at the time, as well as to try to reach out to all of the involved major parties during that period. Unfortunately, most of the people I reached out to, none of them really wanted to get back to me, nor were they interested in talking about what happened at the time. Although, looking at the interviews that they did give to others, as well as all the information I did find out about what had happened since then, I can see why most of them wouldn't want to do it, as it does seem to have been quite a dark time for most of the people involved. But that said, even though they didn't want to talk to a random dude on the internet about all of the trauma that he went through at the time, that didn't stop this one random dude from trying to look into things for himself and trying to figure out what had happened during the entire period. And so this video is basically the follow-up to the thing I mentioned back then, where if enough people are interested, maybe I'll do more looking into it. And so this is that video. For those of you who already know who the company are, you can probably skip this part. I'll put the time code you can skip to somewhere on the screen maybe, and you can just skip to that point, or better yet, you can probably use the chapters if I didn't mess it up this time around. So ImageEpoch was a company founded by Mikage Ryohei. He was someone who initially worked in the Tales studio. Yes, the Namco Tales of series studio, so not some furry thing with tail in its name or something like that. Don't get it twisted. Where he would work for 11 months, including on titles such as Tales of the Abyss, before moving on to form his own company. According to an interview that he did with GameBusiness.jp, he also mentions how prior to his graduation, before he went to work for Bandai Namco, he had already experienced working with about 8 to 9 other game companies during his university years, mostly on the graphical design side, so everything from the planning to the modeling, the animating, the motions and the characters and all of that. And that he had even had the opportunity to work with movie studios as well, if his words are to be believed, that is. Initially set up as a limited partnership company in 2004, the company was formally incorporated in 2005, and within its initial members included some people who would go on to be fairly big within the industry as well, such as ex-Sega / Namco / Konami veteran Komura Issei, who apparently only worked in the Konami part for about 6 months. He was someone who worked on many big titles as a graphic designer at the time, including Eternal Arcadia as well as Sakura Taisen 3. So the company initially started off doing odd jobs in graphic designs for many of the other bigger companies out there. And the main reason why they actually got incorporated at the time was because of the fact that being a limited partnership company actually was such a weird title that many companies, when they actually tried to cold call out to those companies to look for work, they actually got rejected because people just thought they were some shady company because of the fact that they weren't fully incorporated. They finally moved into development of their own original title in 2006, and they actually completed this title, Luminous Arc, in 2007, which the game did, I think, 70 out of 100 on Metacritic and a 28 out of 40 on Famitsu, which, not the best, but it still did fairly well for the first title ever created by a team of just 30 people at the time. Not to mention the fact that most of the people in the team were still fairly young. I think Mikage himself was only around 25, so it was a time where the team was likely still, while you could say they had some years of experience, they weren't the most veteran of teams, and they were all still like largely a very small team. So the fact that they managed to push out a title of that quality in that span of time was still something that was quite impressive. And it was in November of that same year that they began to expand the company even more, and you can see that this expansion really helped them to start to produce games at a wider scale, as they actually not only made a sequel to Luminous Arc within the next 2 years, but they also released a bunch of new series including The Sense of Destruction, Seventh Dragon, Arcrise Fantasia on the Wii, as well as I think they helped to develop a Conan game that also did release on the Wii. And they also assisted in the development of Super Smash Bros. Brawl, as well as the first Valkyria Chronicles, so they really were getting their hands in many places during just those 2 years alone. In 2009, they actually did bring in someone fairly big to help with the development of Seven Dragons in the form of Niinou Kazuya, who would go on to actually be involved in the production of many other titles within the company. And he was someone who actually had quite a fair bit of success even before entering ImageEpoch. He was the director and chief planner for Etrian Odyssey. He worked on the third Devil Summoner game as the systems director, and he was a supervisor on the Trauma Center game that was released on the DS as well. Going on from 2009, they were actually starting to get involved in many deals with other companies as well to produce some games for them, such as a Puchito Blackrock shooter game for the Nico Nico Doga application, as well as designing content for a browser game called Master of Epoch, the Renaissance Age universe. No, that was not me mispronouncing it. The words in the title were actually kind of combined like this. So it really is just called the Renaissance Age. Renaissance Age universe? Look, okay, the name doesn't really matter. It's a browser game that's already dead at this point. The company was actually doing so well that Mikage actually turned up as a speaker at the SADC of 2009, which for those of you who do not know what SADC is basically like, you can think of it as GDC, except that it's a event that happens in Japan that is mostly exclusively for the developers within the corporate game industry itself to jack each other off instead. And well, I don't really physically mean that, although some people might actually do that there at the event, you never know. For the most part, the event really was just a way for many of the big companies to share between them some of the things that they actually learned, as well as some of the tips and tricks that they have for the rest of the industry. So, companies such as Bandai Namco, Nintendo, Konami, and the like would all gather there to basically share information, and a lot of it doesn't really get out to the public much. Point is that this is an event that mostly the big boys in the industry would get brought to and would mostly participate in. So there is some level of recognition of ImageEpoch as a fairly successful company, which is part of the reason why they were given a space to speak at the event. And it was during this event where they also mentioned that they were planning to take the company public going forward. At this time, the guy was still only 28 years old and is already considering to set up his own publication company to help push JRPGs even more into the rest of the world, or so his grandiose plan seemed to be at the time. And so there was some within the game industries, like journalists reporting side of things, that basically were calling him the new leader of like the potential next generation of RPG creators. Because, you know, Final Fantasy and the like was basically turning into the old man boomer thing, cause reasons, I guess, at the time. However, this meteoric success was very short-lived, and I would say that in the end, his company and the way it felt is kind of a very good microcosm of the state of the Japanese game industry and why it overall is also starting to decline nowadays. In 2010, the company actually recorded its first loss of 4.5 billion yen and actually fell into insolvency. A lot of this later on was actually attributed to by the people within the company who did come out and speak about the information of what happened at the time, as being largely due to office politics and a shift in the company culture from the initial let's take the risk to make what we want to let's make what is safe and what is likely to bring in the stable profits for us instead. By the year 2011, things really weren't looking very well for the company. At the time, most of the departments were already running the red, and the only one that was actually earning any form of revenue and was still in the black for the company was just Komura Issei's design department. However, the incident that would shift the fortunes of the company into the negative and would finally drive the nail into their coffin was the massive earthquake and tsunami that hit the Tohoku region in 2011. Yes, that was the one that actually caused the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Basically, while it did not directly affect the people within the company themselves, many of them actually were evacuated from the building, and while they didn't know the extent of the disaster at the time it happened, for Komura Issei, when he went back home and he saw the level of the damage that had been done by the earthquake as well as the tsunami, it apparently flipped a switch within him that actually started to make him question all of the work that he was doing in the company right now. In an interview he gave just a few years ago, he also mentioned that at the time after seeing the aftermath of the earthquake, he actually thought to himself, I could very well be dead tomorrow. Am I truly satisfied with this job being my final job? Frankly, the fact that he thought he could die tomorrow and the first thing that came to his mind was his job is probably the most Japanese salaryman thing that I could ever imagine, especially when you consider the fact that at the time he was married and about to have kids. So the fact that his first thought wasn't, oh shit, I may never get to see my family again, or I need to be there for them, but shit, I don't know if I want to be doing this job or moving to another one. grade A salary man, more so than me. I give my channel name to him if he ever wants to start a YouTube channel. As a fellow wage slave, I respect that. But yeah, so at the end of all of that, the decision that he came to was that if he was gonna do one last job before he dies, if this was gonna be his last one, he didn't want to end up regretting it. Coincidentally for him, later on as he was speaking to the development head, who was also in the company for quite a long time, he found out that they too were thinking of doing something similar, and so the two of them planned their departure from the company together. Now, in his interview, he actually didn't mention who this development head was, but thankfully for you guys, I do seem to have some brain problems, so I went to dig through all of the information I could find and cross-referenced all of it, doing basically the insane meme man thing of having the board and like linking all the thing, except that I don't have a physical board. I just basically linked my brain stems together, which might actually be a little bit damaging to the human brain itself, since I don't think those can regenerate. But hey, at least we did manage to pin it down to someone who seems to be called Kuroki Takashi, who I actually managed to track to also having been someone who was involved with the company since the SEDEC presentation in 2009. Even more interestingly, however, is the fact that he actually then brought the fact that he was planning to quit up to Mikage himself, which was a very interesting move in the sense that it was really a good show of how much trust he actually had in Mikage, that he was willing to bring this all up to him directly to actually discuss with him before even deciding whether or not to resign. I mean, to be fair, he initially left his job to join Mikage as one of the initial people within ImageEpoch due to the respect he had from him from the days that they actually worked together back in Namco's in the Tales Studios. So I can see why he would be actually willing to actually do this all, especially since they have been all at this together since the start. But the fact that he was actually willing to go up to his boss and tell him like, hey, you know, I actually really don't want to work here anymore. I think I want to go quit and make my own company, basically doing the same job I'm doing now in the company here. So basically, I'm going to become our competitor, but I just really don't want to do it here with the type of jobs that we have, especially when you consider the fact that his department was the only one that was actually making money for the company at the time. It takes a lot of balls, takes a little bit of thick skin as well, I feel like, to be able to go up to the company and be like, hey, yeah, no. And this is especially so in Japan, where even though with the game industry, the idea of mobility between companies is something that is taken a lot more as a norm, since people do expect that more often than not people will move within 3 to 5 years. It is still something that in a country where the norm is to actually stay with a company for a much longer period of time, sometimes for your entire life. The idea of being willing to just back away from the company, especially when it's in such dire straits, is something that many people may not even think of in Japan. And what was even more interesting on top of that, like this entire part of the story just feels like something that you would see in a television drama, I feel like. But at the point, after hearing all of what he had to say, Mikage apparently replied to him telling him that if the two of you leave, the company can't survive. If you're really determined to leave, however, take your entire department with you and go independent in Komura. Which for a person leading a company that at the time was planning the IPO was just wild, since, you know, letting the one guy who was basically ensuring profitability in your company quit and take his entire department with him feels like it would have just dashed any dreams of actually being able to do that in the end. Like, it really is interesting to see this like bond that exists between the two of them that would allow or make them willing to actually go through this entire dramatic scene to begin with. By this point, Tokitowa would probably have been midway through its development as well, so he probably realized how much the company was struggling with getting that title released at the scale and ambition that he initially had wanted it to be. And not only that, but Fate Extra would have also already released, which, look, alright, okay, as much as I do love Tamamo, you know, I do have a figure of her right over. She's all the way over there, as you can see. Right, I love the storytelling elements. I love the way the whole clue system existed, so that you had to like figure out who the other person's servants were and all of that. But when it comes to the gameplay elements of Fate Extra, for those of you who have played it, I'm sure most people wouldn't disagree with the fact that gameplay-wise, the game was actually hot garbage. I mean, like, the fact that you couldn't really grind in this RPG game So like the higher your level was, the less EXP you would get from the same enemy. The fact that the entire battle system was basically just rock, paper, scissors, except that like half the time you were actually guessing, so it's just like a sword fest of whether or not you got things right or not. Like there were many things about it that were very frustrating, and they probably realized that like yeah, they actually did do well with the sales of that title, but that was more likely to have been due to the director as well as the people on Type Moon's side actually pulling their weight to pull together a interesting story experience that managed to some extent at least, keep people unaware or distracted from the fact that the gameplay itself was just ass the whole time. The reason why I'm bringing all this up is not because I'm some weird fanboy who thinks that like my boner is the sword of this bone or whatever the fuck the funny weird man in the series says. It's more due to the fact that all of this will become relevant to this story of ImageEpoch as we go on later on, and also due to the fact that actually many of the things that actually made Fate Extra so successful were actually proposed by the director from ImageEpoch instead. Niinou Kazuya was the person who basically decided to bring in Wadako in the first place to do the art for the game. He was the one who decided that Nero should be the motive of the main character. He was also the one who basically tried to push for Far Eastern characters, basically characters from like Japan and China, to be allowed into the plotline again, as apparently according to Type Moon, there was a ban on using more characters from the East after the whole Sasaki Kojiro thing. And if anything, Nasu was the one who initially doubted whether or not Nero would actually be a good fit for the Saber because of the worries about whether or not the personality of the character could actually be implemented well. And, you know, it was thanks to his push from Niinou Kazuya that all of this actually came to fruition. So this goes to show that there were actually really talented people who were also very proactive within ImageEpoch as well, and they were actually quite responsible for the success for some of the titles that they actually worked on, with Fate Extra being a title that was proposed by the director on ImageEpoch's side first, and then brought to Type Moon. Anyway, moving back to the story of ImageEpoch itself, at this point, Mikage had basically given Komura his blessing to begin doing what he needed to do to leave the company with his team. So he basically set about to try and get office space as well as all of the supplies needed, the computers and all of that, that would be sufficient for the people who he was planning to bring with him when he leaves the company. And he actually mentions in his interview that by the time he was already prepared to leave, he had basically secured about 6 months worth of work for them. So quite a lot of work that you can imagine was basically being prepared for him to bring his entire department with him. And after all of that, he basically went back to tell Mikage that he was basically more or less ready to leave. And at the time, for some reason, even though he told him that like, yeah, go for it before, Mikage was suddenly like, no, could you at least leave like 5 people in leadership positions from your department? So he agreed to it and then announced his departure to the whole company. However, it was at that point where the bigger company overall, it would seem that many people were unhappy with his decision. And he was actually brought into a meeting with the rest of the board. They had basically pulled some kind of power play on him, because while he had told Mikage about all of this, and Mikage was fine with it, and while he had told most of the board of directors privately what he was planning to do, he had not officially tried to get their approval to basically bring his entire department and leave the company with him, is what they basically told him. And they used this as a opportunity to basically accuse him of basically trying to launch a coup, which were the words that he apparently quoted them saying at the time itself. And they basically use this as an opportunity to call both Komura as well as the development head into a meeting and basically accuse them of trying to instigate something within the company, and basically lock them away from the rest of the departments and prevented them from contacting the rest of their staff. Basically the standard Japanese thing, you know, where you basically put people in the naughty corner and don't let them really do much until they feel like they just need to leave the company. It's a real thing, you know, where they basically just put you in a very horrible situation with no work, and you're not really allowed to slack off in the room either, and they basically just try to drive you insane from the fact that you're basically not being able to do anything at all. And so really being left with no choice, since they won't even be able to contact the rest of the department, they just had to leave with just the 2 of them instead. And this basically means that the 2 of them were back to square one. Well, I guess at this point, they were back to square -40, because due to the fact that they were only able to live on their own and not of the entire department, it basically meant that they were not able to fulfill the 6 months of contract they had secured. They were basically stuck with an office space that they had to take out a loan to rent, as well as for all the supplies that they had rented out or purchased at the time, which they basically also had to pay the penalties for the non-fulfillment of the contract, as well as for the early cancellation of the rental for things such as the offers as well. They kind of realized that even if they sold everything, as well as tried to get all of the money that they basically had, as well as all of the money they had saved up for their kids, because once again, like Komura at the time was someone who already had kids and was planning to actually, apparently, according to him at the time, move to a larger home for the sake of, having enough space for the kid that he was about to have. They would still be 10 million yen in debt between the two of them, which yeah, it's a pretty bad scenario to be in. That said, this is where I'm gonna edge you guys a little. Becoming a little bit of a brain rot myself, I must admit. It's probably not a good thing, but yes, this is where I'm going to edge you guys a little, and we'll come back to her story a little later. For now, we are going to first see the story of ImageEpoch itself as the company towards the end, before we talk about what happened to all of the big people within the company at the time, including Mikage as well as Niinou Kazuya. That said, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out that this did nothing for the company's profitability. Hell, even a guy suffering from massive brain rot from flicker gunning for like 7 seconds straight probably would have realized it. But yeah, this, if anything, likely had the reverse effect on the company instead, because as you can imagine, having the most profitable and the only profitable department for that matter in the company losing its head basically isn't gonna do much for their morale nor for their direction, since most of the work would have likely been going through him as well. So the one guy who would have been managing all of these people and keeping them on track would have been gone at this point. And anything that they could try to do to get someone else to replace him likely would take some time for the person to adapt. If the person is even able to adapt to fill the shoes of someone who was basically one of the longest standing people within the company. And so the company just never really did recover from all of this, it does feel like. In fact, when you look at the games they produced from then on, in 2012 they only really released 2 titles, one of which became the, well, not the Kasou Game of the Year, but one of the runner-ups to become the Kasou Game of the Year. And when you look at 2013, they didn't really produce anything horrible on that level, but the only things that they really produced in that year were mostly just sequels for already pre-existing titles. So really playing into the whole mentality of make what's safe and will earn us some money and not bomb really feels like it became the norm in the company at that point. And because of the fact that the norm that the company earns isn't really that impressive of amount to begin with, it really wasn't enough to continue supporting the company as the size that it had already grown to. In fact, the situation was so dire in 2012 that Mikage actually mentioned in a later interview that if the company was a boat, they would have to drop 7 out of every 10 people or the entire ship would sink. And apparently he actually regretted trying to keep the company afloat at that point simply because of all of the mental stress that had put him through trying to manage the company through the remaining 2 to 3 years of its existence. In utter desperation, they actually tried moving into smartphone games at the time, kind of like many of the other companies that were underperforming at the time. Which, yes, that also includes Square Enix. Apparently Tomb Raider and Hitman Absolution really did a number on them. However, unlike Square Enix, which actually managed to find its place in the market after a lot of experimentation and failure, with ImageEpoch, they just found it a little too difficult to break into the mobile game market simply because the types of things that you need to take into consideration as well as the styles of development are very different. As someone who kind of had the very weird opportunity to work on both, I can attest to the fact that the two are very starkly different in the ways that you do need to think about development, because with a consumer title like an RPG game like what ImageEpoch is used to making, you typically tend to create a game which is a complete experience in and of itself. So you would want to ensure that whatever you balance, whatever you create in terms of the plot, the stories, the characters, you can keep them small and contained and basically complete within the experience that you want to give. But with a mobile game, especially the live service games that you see nowadays, you tend to need to create something that can last for a long period of time. And so for the initial product that you create, it has to be incomplete when it goes into the market, in the sense that there are going to be things in the game's balance that will be lacking, because you want people to spend more on either characters or on resources going forward. and you want them to basically grind for the resources over an extended period of time. So in a way, you could say that mobile games are kind of like the modern AAA titles where you're just releasing an incomplete game on launch, except that it would seem that the mobile games actually do a better job of actually ensuring that the experience itself is completed over time, because at least sometimes they bother to fix their game. So instead, ImageEpoch kind of had to start to begin to shrink the company, and from there, news of them actually not being able to pay their subcontractors started to come up more and more, and many of the staff, especially from the art department that actually left the company at the time or got fired, started to move over to Komura's company instead. Apparently, a massive project that they were working on during that period had been cancelled, and the cancellation of that project led to them having to record extraordinary losses that basically caused the company to become unable to pay back its debts, something that I guess is quite linked to what Mikage was initially worried about, which is the fact that with a title, you're putting in so much cost and getting your profits only at the very end of the production cycle, and so cancelling a project like this would basically be something that could potentially be big enough to cripple the company, and it is exactly what happened in their case. And with this, just like that, it was all over. Within 10 years, the company that was touting itself as being the new upcoming champion of the JRPG genre had basically died with a whimper instead, going out in the most sad way possible, which is quite a shame because even in their last few years, it's not like all titles that they made were bad, right? They made Soul Trigger, and I found that game to actually be pretty fun, to be honest as well. It's just that it was quite unfortunate that by this point, especially after Toki and Towa, within Japan, their reputation had been hurt so badly that even with Soul Trigger, it was a title that didn't really manage to break that far past the original Luminous Arc sales. This resulted in their latest entry into the Luminous Arc series actually being completed by Stellar instead, and the game that was supposed to celebrate their 10th anniversary, Stellar Glow, was actually sold by Sega instead, after the company had already declared bankruptcy. And Sega would go on to inherit both Stellar Glow as well as some of the other IPs that belonged to ImageEpoch at the time. The company entered liquidation in 2015, and it was at the start of the year where rumors started to spread that Mikage had basically fled in the night because of all of the debts that the company had. In February, their office was already cleared and actually put back up for rent, and for some weird reason, the CEO of Idea Factory, the company that is known as one of the biggest Kasuge developers within Japan, pulled up a tweet saying that he couldn't reach out to Mikage like 2 days after April Fool's, which was the day where the website for ImageEpoch went down. And he was like trying to ask people on Twitter if they could point out how he could contact Mikage, which is like, bruh, like why the fuck are you asking Twitter to do it? Like, yeah, Twitter, do your thing, stalk the man for me. Like, I don't know what he was expecting out of it, to be honest. Like, if they were close enough for him to actually worry, I feel like he probably would have better and more direct access to the dude than like random man A on Twitter would. Then when they actually released Trillion God of Destruction, which I think released in 2016, for some reason, like, Idea Factory decided to do some weird parody thing where they got some guy to dress and pretend to like do things that made him look similar to Mikage, like doing the same pose with the like wearing a wrestler mask and like doing all of that to like make it look like he was him. I think like I don't know what this was all about. And then there were like weird conspiracy theories about how like if you line up the text on the screen at the time, then it's like it actually basically says contact him or something. Like it's like I don't know why he did all of this. It kind of feels distasteful, especially if you consider the fact that at the time no one really knew what happened to the dude, so he could have very well offed himself or is just like completely missing and actually fled the country or choose to disappear himself or something. So it was very bizarre that they were even doing any of that to begin with and like viewing conspiracy theories about where the dude was. And yeah, no news was heard from Mikage for years after that. And in 2016, the proceedings were completed and the company liquidated. So I don't understand what Idea Factory was going on about with that. I know that they actually interviewed him once in the past about something else, just like about the whole Galapagos brand that they were planning to make, but it just feels bizarre to me that they were even like putting all of this like talk about him out there in this way at the time. So from personal experience working within the game industry in Japan, one thing that I feel did likely contribute to why the company saw this kind of decline, and that isn't really mentioned both by the people who were interviewed within the company as well as by the people who speculated on why the company actually ended up in this situation, is the fact that the company did actually undergo a massive expansion at the time, going from 30 staff in 2007 to 120 in 2010, which, as you can imagine, that may be just a little bit of a very devastating thing for the company, especially for one that started as a group of very young dude bros who basically for whom game design was just their passion at the time. And as a result, they may have just been bringing some of the management within the company itself, because as someone who has worked in both fairly big as well as fairly small game development companies, like the one that I'm currently working in, I think it only started at around maybe like 20-30 people as well, and it's also seeing a similar form of expansion at this point. What I can say is that with many of these small companies, many of them do tend to be very scuffed in terms of their initial management practices and the like. Like I've seen some where they are actually like doing the P&L, trying to estimate the cost of developing a title. They just don't include manpower costs at all for some reason. Some where corporate funds are being handled purely by the boss as if out of his own personal wallet, and they just handle most of the compensation and stuff within the company in cash. So instead of them actually depositing the money that should be owed to you for the expenses that you incurred and the process of work for the company back into your bank account, they just go into a safe in the company and just like hand it to you in cash instead. So it does feel like a lot of the money just like moves around outside of the view of actual like recording systems that a company should ought to be expected to have. Fact of the matter is, there's just many things that these companies do that when we look at it now, we will all find to be pretty weird. But because of the fact that these were at the time very small companies, it was a lot easier for them to micromanage all these kind of things. And there are many things that they could do that simply just kind of managed to work its way out, simply due to the fact that the people that were hired in were all handpicked, and they all therefore tended to share a more solidified single version of what they wanted to do and what the end goal was to be. However, as the staff count increases and the company expands more and more, there is a need to start to then divide the people into different divisions to ensure that they can smoothly work on each of the differing titles that the company may be simultaneously working on, as well as the other projects from other companies that you might also be concurrently working on. This will also start to result in the hiring process being split towards each division hiring their own people to fulfill whatever goals that the division has at the time. The people you hire in might have very differing goals, which may lead to very differing motivations in how they work. The people who were originally within the company would eventually start to get outnumbered by the huge number of people coming in from the outside. And because of the fact that this all happens so rapidly, right, you're gonna have like 90 new people joining the company within such a short time frame. Most of the people aren't going to know each other very well and wouldn't be as acquainted to or haven't been through the hell that the other original 30 might have had in like producing a title in a single year at a time. And so it actually becomes a good breeding ground for this kind of cliques to form, and especially the broad hiring practices that companies within Japan tend to have, wherein companies are more willing to hire in people with no experience or with very light experience overall in the space itself. Like when I worked in Koei, there were literally people coming in with just degrees in English or degrees in mineralogy to actually help with developing games. And companies were basically doing this because they believed that they had the ability as well as the time to hire in people and train them up. And it's more important to hire in people with the right attitude rather than with the right skill set, because skill sets could be trained, or so they believed. It also meant that these companies would then have a much bigger spectrum in terms of the level of skill and experience that people in the firm would have. That and the fact that they were trying to produce multiple like smaller scale titles while rapidly expanding the company at the same time is something that I feel may have also hurt their ability to actually develop titles of quality at the time, simply due to the fact that they would basically have to stretch the veterans within the company quite thin to basically cover all of these new titles while also adding in a lot of new people with whom the current people within the company may not be as adjusted to working with, all while also potentially having to train some of them up at the same time if some of them were more on the fresh side. and therefore you can't really wing scheduling the same way anymore, because you can't just expect that the new cowboy Tanaka that you just hired in would have the same level of experience and therefore be able to work at the same speed as the guy who you have been working with for a very long time and who may have already been a veteran in the industry by the time you hired him. And this isn't all just based completely off of my own anecdotal speculation on the period either. Rather, it is also based off of what Komura Issei, who had at the time been put into more of an upper managerial position and who was interviewed about some of this after the fact, had to say about the period as well, when he did mention that scheduling was one thing that they actually found to be very difficult to do at the time, and things that, for example, he was scheduled to take 10 months to complete ended up taking 1 year instead. And so this basically means that additional months worth of work had to be put into something, and this would push the rest of the schedule back a lot more as well, meaning that titles took longer to develop, and this also basically means that more costs are incurred in the development of a single title, and while each individual feature didn't hurt them so much when it got delayed, the end result, which is that all of the delays stacked together, ended up causing the amount of cost incurred to balloon more and more, to the point that all of this actually contributed a fair amount to why the company ended up in the situation that it was monetarily. Adding on to this, he also mentioned how the lack of proper communication basically caused a lot of distrust within the company. That, and it didn't help either that because of the fact that the company was planning the IPO, Mikage was basically running around trying to drum up investor support and attention in the company, and basically telling everyone outside the company that they were doing super well and they're making the big bucks. Meanwhile, inside the company itself, it would seem that the pay itself was actually getting frozen for everyone there. So for the people who didn't know why all of this was going on, they were looking at the situation and the lack of communication from Mikage as a very odd sign, as they really weren't sure whether to trust his words to the public that the company was really doing well, or if he was just being like really abusive and intentionally cutting their pay to maximize revenue or profits for himself. And so a lot of things like this, and the fact that because of the fact that he wasn't as close to the members of the team now, perhaps some of them may not have been given the memo that this was all being done with a specific goal in mind, and that a lot of it probably wasn't disseminated to the rest of the company, which basically was now staffed with many people who weren't as close to him or didn't know him as well, and therefore wouldn't be able to, or maybe wouldn't just be willing to just blindly trust that he had a good plan in mind, and therefore, as you can imagine, this would lead to even more distrust and politicking within the company as well. And it's not only that their costs were increasing, but in terms of revenue as well, they actually weren't doing that much better than they were a few years ago. Rise Fantasia is a game that many people do say that they really like many years after the original release, but when you look at the year of release of the game itself, it only did around 26,000 in sales in the first month and 49,000 by the end of the year, so that wasn't really high. For reference, 26,000 is about the same as the very first Luminous arc, so even though the game actually did see some level of popularity after the fact and does have some level of a cult following today, at the time its sales were about the same as the first DS game that they had made back when the company was a lot smaller. Luminous Arc 3 also did fairly about similar numbers as well, and the only game that actually did well around that period was 7th Dragon, which did 4 times the sales of the original Luminous Arc. But the thing is that basically what you're seeing is that overall, while the size of the company itself had pretty much quadrupled and the amount of time that was being spent on development of individual titles was also getting longer, the company was only earning about maybe 6 times the amount of money that they were initially earning all those years back. And not only that, they were actually getting a lot more bigger names into the assist with the development of the titles. For example, with Rise Fantasia, it also was a title that brought in quite a few people, veterans from the Tales series as well, to assist with its development, since the team, especially thanks to Mikage himself, did have some level of ties back to Bandai Namco as well as the Tales of team. They also brought in a fairly popular musician at the time, so they really were bringing in a lot more people who were likely also taking a cut of the profit. So while we could look at these titles and be like, oh yeah, overall they made 3 titles, they saw a 6 times increase in revenue, some of the profit would have to be split more with other parties than originally was the case with the original Luminous arc. And the company itself also did see a quadruple in its staff size, so a lot of money is probably going into cost on that front as well. Plus, their choice of consoles may have also hurt their ability to turn a profit to some extent. And no, I'm not being one of those elitists who's going to go like, hey, well, actually, PC Master Race, or some cringy shit like that. No, it was really the case that, and this is something that, for example, with Arc-Rise Fantasia, Wada Yasuhiro, the creator of Harvest Moon, who worked in Marvelous, basically a company that worked together with ImageEpoch on Arc-Rise Fantasia, later came out stating that it was actually quite difficult to sell third-party games on the Wii. As he highlights in the article, that it's not so much that the console physically is the problem, but more so that the Wii has a huge audience of more casual gamers. Basically people that he characterizes as those who are more likely to purchase a game based off of the brand image that the brand itself has, basically how popular the brand already is. So if you're something as big as a Capcom or Square Enix, for example, you're likely to see the same level of success on the Wii as well. However, because of the fact that many of the users are more casual, they are less likely to trust brands that they have never seen before. And so for a brand like Marvelous, which was at the time less well known, it's a lot harder for them to break into the Wii's market simply because people, even if they wanted to try something new, were likely to just go and purchase something made by a company that they already recognize the name of, rather than to try to go after something that, like, let's say for example, ImageEpoch, which while they were rising within the industry, was still fairly niche compared to the bigger names on the title, and who were on average averaging maybe a quarter of what many of these big brands were achieving on most of these consoles to begin with. And when you look at the later titles they released after their initial forays on the Nintendo 3DS as well as on the Wii, when we look at the PSP, they started to release games there mostly around 2010 to 2013. Arguably the era of the PSP's life where it was struggling the most with piracy. For those of you who are not too aware of the history of piracy on the PSP, 2009 was when the Pandora method was first introduced, which actually simplified a lot of the difficulty with actually pirating for the PSP. And from there, you basically started to see it get more and more refined. And around 2011, the era where the life cycle of the PSP was really near its end, you basically had custom firmware that allowed it to be very easily pirated, and at the time it was largely being used more by people who wanted to make homebrew games. But yeah, you know, it's not just them that are going to be using it. People who wanted to play the new titles, especially some that may not be as readily available, could just go through these sources and easily acquire the games as well. When you look at the period from 2010 onwards, this is when they actually released some pretty good titles on the PSP. Right, Criminal Goals was a game which, it's a little gooner. You could say that this game was the Nikkei before Nikkei was a thing, but nonetheless, that game actually, systems-wise and plot-wise, did actually have a lot of interesting things going for it. And no, okay, I'm saying plot as in the actual story, not that kind of plot, you sicko. Fate Extra, the Black Rock shooter game, maybe that one was a little iffy. I think that one, it was really a hit or miss with people. The sequels to Seventh Dragon as well as the Fate sequel, all of this all released on the PSP, and yeah, while the Fate games did see an increase in sales in spite of the fact that it was on the PSP, you could also chalk that up to the fact that they had a very strong IP going for them, and they were actually selling limited edition boxes that I think came for a figure at the time, so you really were seeing them actually selling and giving people incentive to purchase the physical version, more so than some of the original titles that ImageEpoch had made in the past. And I feel like it's a combination of these two big issues that basically led the company to perform as poorly as it did at the time.
He would rather play the video games than be with me sexually.
Sorry about that. Went to get some coffee. As you can see, we're back on another day, and this is because of the fact that we are now going to talk about the second half of the video where we're going to look at what happened to everyone after the company had dissolved, because I know that there are people out there who have made videos on ImageEpoch up till this point, but one thing that I feel tends to get neglected when talking about the company is what happened to all of the people aside from Mikage, who seems to be the focal point of a lot of what people talk about with the company. Because the interesting thing with ImageEpoch is that while the company may have just faded away at this point, many of the people within the company would go on to actually have quite a fair bit of an impact within the Japanese game industry itself in many different ways. And I feel that focusing too much on just Mikage alone kinda takes away from within the company have done since then as well. For starters, let us look at the person who arguably in the entire drama that surrounded ImageEpoch probably played the least part among all of its important members, but who ended up probably becoming one of the most successful people after he had left the company. And that would be Niinou Kazuya, who, as a reminder, is the director for Seventh Dragon, the producer for Fate Extra, as well as the person who initially came up with the idea for Criminal Girls. So, if you ever wondered why that series was one that ended up being so gooner compared to the rest of the stuff that ImageEpoch had released till then, you have this guy to thank or blame for that. I mean, he was the same guy who in an interview basically stated that the reason why there are so many Sakuras in Fate Extra is because of the fact that he was a really big Sakura fan, and he really wanted to make a game with multiple Sakuras in it, so hey, he has his priorities really straight on. I can respect that. But anyway, with him, we don't exactly know the year that he exactly left the company, but we do know that the last title he was involved in was the 7th Dragon 2020 and 2011. 2012 and 13, he wasn't really involved with any of the titles, or at least not credited for any of the titles, and he wasn't even involved in Fate Extra CCC, which the producer at the time had already been passed on to another person. And we do know that in the later half of 2013, he was already involved in the development of other titles within Square Enix instead. So suffice to say, somewhere between 11 to maybe the early half of 2013, he had already left the company. Which I would love to say that after he moved to Square Enix, things were a lot better and he managed to live a peaceful life. But the thing is that the first title he was put in once he moved there was as the assistant director for FF14 A Realm Reborn, so for those of you who know the story of FF14, yeah, a lot of weight on his shoulders the moment he went in, since they really did need that title to succeed after everything that had been botched to the series up to that point for 14 itself. After which he worked on Dragon Quest Builders 1 and 2, which both were a lot more fine, I suppose. They weren't as rough as with FF14 itself, so he basically produced both of those titles as the director, and then moved on to work for Type Moon Studio B, where he would basically work on the rest of the Fate Extra series again. So, in a way, I guess things really came full circle for him. And hey, he in the end got his wish in a weird way, I suppose, where now he gets to live making games with all of her Sakura waifus in it for the rest of however long they wish to push that series for. So, sounds like he's a fairly happy man. And he got to work with some of the biggest IPs out there as well. So, I would say that as a guy who left ImageEpoch in the state that it was, and then getting to work on Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and then more like Fate Extra stuff, he probably was the person who had the best life going on after having left ImageEpoch. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately in his case, no one really actually interviewed him about his time in ImageEpoch, so he really hasn't spoken out about anything that happened at the time. The most he has talked about was specifically his work on the Fate Extra series. Okay, this jacket is getting really hot. Like, I think I've mentioned that before on previous videos, but this room is not the best since I can't open the window, so even in winter, the temperature in here goes up quite a fair bit. But next up, don't worry, we're not going to go into Mikage's story just yet. I feel like his is the one that most people have already talked about. Instead, I'll stop aging you guys and we'll talk about the story of what happened to Komura. So, in the last episode of Holy Shit My Life is Fucked, Bro and his homie were both left with a 10 million yen debt. They really didn't have a use for the offers that they had at the time, which he had to pay for within 2 weeks, and no staff to complete all the contracts that he managed to actually gather to fund the company for the first 6 months of its operation. So, many contracts that basically the schedule got ruined for, and that he might have had to pay non-performance for, and which may have also ruined his reputation to some extent because of everything that had happened. Not only that, but the loan they had taken out to get all of this settled had to be re-evaluated as well, since the 40-man company that they had proposed when they actually got the loan ended up only being 2 men, so the interest went up on that. And not only that, but he basically had to sell the home that he had gotten for when his child was actually going to be born. So basically, they had to accommodate the child in his much smaller original home, all with the threat of personal bankruptcy along the horizon. Things really weren't the best for this guy at the time. Arguably, a person who was in a much worse situation than Mikage, in spite of how much people talk about how bad his situation was as well. Thankfully for him, however, he had contacts in an accounting office that apparently had connections to the Japan Finance Corporation, which, don't worry, that's not some company that sounds like an evil megacorp loan shark or something. That's actually a Japanese government finance institution that actually helps to fund SMEs to some extent. He managed to convince them to put in a good word for him with the institution, which basically allowed him to secure a deposit from the institution in advance before the evaluation was even complete. Like, it sounds maybe illegal at that point, but thanks to that, he actually managed to get some money, which, while he couldn't use it to settle the debt, he managed to use it to liquidate all of the assets as well as pay back the non-performance of contracts as well as for the office space's early contract cancellation. So he at least managed to settle everything else, so all he had to focus left on, along with his director partner, was the 10 million yen debt that they were still stuck in what was probably the most shonen manga-esque plot twist of all time, like through the sheer powers of like friendship and like some Bakuman-esque scene. Basically, at that point, many of his old contacts actually heard about what had happened, and they had actually offered to give him and the other director some work to help them tide over the period and to help basically cover the situation that they were in. So at least they managed to secure some work, and the two of them ended up operating out of literal parks, like, yeah, like, you know, where people go to let their dogs take a shit and bang behind the trees? Yeah, like literally just walking out of those. And when it would rain, they apparently would work in convenience stores instead. And they basically had to try to get by working like actual nomads at the time. Things finally took a turn for the better when NHN Japan CEO actually reached out to them. Apparently, they were working on a Strike Witches browser game at the time, and they were actually having trouble trying to progress the game, and so they asked the two of them to come and help assist in the development of the title as part of the team. That said, even though they were put in the position of director and art director for that project, they still were somehow operating out of parks for a fair bit even after that. But as the project progressed and a prototype was actually more solidified, they were finally given some workspace within the company to continue developing the title, as apparently at the time NHN Japan had just disbanded a subsidiary that they had, so they just had some office space left behind that still had a few months left in its contract. And so they lent that entire office space out to the two of them, all while still paying for all of the utilities and all of that. So at least things did turn for the better, and it didn't seem like a complete Scrooge as a result of all of this. Once there, they basically continued to work on the title. NHN Japan even provided them with more people, with them actually forming a 10-man team working in that office, and they would actually move in with NHN Japan when the company moved its office over to Shibuya when Line Games was set up, where they would continue to work both rent and utilities paid for completely. All of this because of the sheer coincidence that he had built up many contacts with NHN Japan while working with them while he himself was in ImageEpoch on the title Chevalier Saga Tactics. And many of the other art directors that he had contacts with within the industry overall, many of them just happened to concentrate into NHN Japan at that period as well. So many of them helped put in a good word for him, and that was how him and the other director actually managed to not only secure jobs there, but also free office space for their own company while working within NHN games. That said, things didn't remain peachy all the way even then, in spite of the fact that they had undergone two shonen like Super Friends arcs at this point, and the new CEO that came in apparently tried to put too much of his own creative vision into the Strike Witches project that was already underway, and so it ended up causing the game to be heavily simplified, and the game once released ended servers very soon after. So once that was done, they were really just out of a job again, and they were also out of the office space since they didn't really get to keep it or any of the people they were working with while they were working on that title. Thankfully for them, in their third like shonen Super Friends Power of Friendship arc, Artdings, another company within the industry, apparently reached out to them and let them know that, hey, we have some space in our basement that may not be your mom's, but would you like to rent it out for your office space? And apparently that's where they moved on to next. And this was where they began their first like Avengers Endgame-esque like arc of their own story, as well as it was around this period where you started to see most of the ex-employees of ImageEpoch from their respective teams actually start to come into this new company that they had set up as well. So the team was starting to form, and not only that, but the accountant that he had helped him with the whole not shady Japanese finance institution before apparently managed to help him secure an investor who was willing to drop 100 million yen for them to try and make whatever they wanted, while promising not to get too heavily involved within the development process itself. That said, it wasn't the entirety of the team. I believe only like 15 people among all of the people that they initially talked about managed to come together in this company, and decided that since they did manage to gather some level of manpower under them now, that they would try to then make their own game. Unfortunately for them, the two games that they released at the time, Earth Wars and Teku Teku Yusha, both just didn't do very well, with the latter being a mobile game that ended service soon after. This led the investor who initially promised not to intervene to eventually try to push his way in and to try and micromanage them to some extent, seeing how he owned 70% of the company at the time. This led to a lot of disagreements, and that actually led to them splitting up and the company actually shrinking in size once again, as Kuroki basically took 5 of the other members with him and left the company. Another 5 just quit on their own accord, and this just basically left 5 people. So just like in your literal Avengers Endgame brain rot, they basically came together, and then you had your arc where the big bad won, and then they basically got split, with some of them, I guess, a little more than snapped out of existence, since it was more than half of them that disappeared from the firm at that point. However, it was at this point where things seemed to be at the lowest they had been since he was booted out of the company and was settled with a 10 million yen debt, where the next big plot twist that would come in and provide him with a windfall actually happened in the form of the reappearance of a very old friend, or I guess another very familiar old IP. You know, apparently this small developer, Kuroki Takashi, from this small company called Type Moon, you may have heard of them, apparently reached out to him at this point with a line that apparently was so seared into his brain that he would remember it for years to come, because apparently the dude just welcomed him with just one single line at the point. Tekaba yokoso, or welcome to the gambling den. Because yes, this would be the beginning of when they were actually starting to get into the development of Fate Grand Order, the game that would become arguably one of the biggest like gacha games to come out of Japan at the time. And they were looking for someone to help with the development of all of the art and design for the noble phantasms, the super skills of the game, for those of you who have never touched a saber or like this other saber in your life. Because according to an interview that Komura gave many years later, he mentions how for FGO's Noble Phantasm, they were trying to use a very unique in-house tool that Type Moon had developed for the animation of this Noble Phantasm that they would just seem to be very adamant about wanting to use. And so basically him and his team were invited in and were taught how to use these tools, and basically that they had to learn all of this from scratch in order to be able to perform all of this well. In fact, within the same interview, he actually bragged about how, because of how old the application, the software that they were using for all of this was, it had basically become a black box, so he was really confident that no one else would be able to use it to produce Noble Phantasms for Fate Grand Order. And so this is something that's very unique to his company, which I don't think that's a very good thing in any way, that like the software that you use for production has become such a black box that even the devs within your team have only half an idea how to use it, and they are the only ones who can use it. Like that feels really, really bad in more ways than one. Like in terms of the fact that this has basically become a monopoly thing where they are the only ones who can do it, and in the worst case, like, you know, hopefully nothing bad happens to them, but if it does, there is really no one else who can continue on the work that they are doing. So highly risky. I don't think that's something to be bragging about, but I guess for him at the time, this would have been a really massive godsend, because this basically meant that him and his team were basically on task to produce content for arguably one of the biggest games out there. And because of the weird position that they were in, they also basically would have the ability to actually like argue for better pay, or like even a better share of the percentage rather than just a fixed amount per Noble Phantasm if they really wanted to, simply because they have a monopoly on being able to use the software that Type Moon had initially given to them in the first place. Like, I don't understand how these situations get created, but then again, the Japanese game industry is known, especially back in the day, for really having people who don't think too hard about stuff like this, especially when it came to the programmer side of stuff. So, hey, I guess anything goes. That said, while they were really busy during the period where the game was within development, no surprise, because they probably had to produce the biggest amount of the Noble Phantasms for the cast of the game, during that period, since once the game releases, it's really like you're only releasing a small number of characters per month or during the anniversary, so the amount of work overall, the load is lower than trying to finish all of the base game's content within the original time frame. So with the free time that they had, they basically decided to take some of their older titles like Earth Wars, for example, and put it out onto the market again, basically ported for the newer consoles. And the weird thing about the way that they did that was apparently, like, out of the meme of it, because Earth Wars didn't initially do well, they decided like, yeah, you know what? We made this full like consumer title, but like fuck it, we're just gonna release this on the Switch for like fucking 500 yen, you know, 1 coin, like it'll be fine. It's like the price of a single lunch or something. Which, for those of you who do not know, the term 1 coin is a term that's used a lot more in terms of pricing strategies within Japan, because a single maximum value coin here is 500 yen, and 500 yen is about, or at least it used to be prior to like the dark ages that we're in right now. It used to be more or less maybe like $4 to $5 thereabouts, so you could actually get a fair amount of value out of it. You could actually, and even today, you can still kind of buy some meals with that amount alone. So the term 1 coin is basically used when you're talking about pricing a product within the value of a single coin, as it makes people more willing to purchase the item. And I guess within Japan's context, because the price of the largest coin, or the value of the largest coin, is a lot bigger than like most countries where it's just a single dollar. You can kind of aim for a certain level of profitability, even if you're pricing within the value of that single coin. However, the meme actually paid off for them, because the game apparently on the week of its release actually hit the 2nd place on the sales charts within Japan. Yeah, it basically was such a success for them that between this and FGO, it basically pushed them into such a level of success that they were actually able to then begin work on their next title, Lost Epic. Yeah, I guess they did lose the epicness to some extent, especially with like everything that happened to this point. But either way, things did get a lot better from then on. It's not only are they still working on stuff for FGO to this day while producing their own titles, but they're also working on art and modeling for many other big companies out there. In fact, they were also working on some of it for FF7 Rebirth. So actually getting to work with many big companies out there, many successful companies, and arguably they are now in a position where the company is doing a lot better, certainly, than where they were when they initially got booted out of ImageEpoch. A life full of troubles and tribulations, but at the very least, they did finally manage to find success at the end of the tunnel. Although that said, according to them, they're still paying back the 10 million debt even to this day, so not completely fine yet, but it does seem like at the very least for now, they have managed to put themselves in a position where trying to clear that debt might actually be a possibility. As for the director from ImageEpoch who left with Komura and who stuck things out with him for quite a fair bit, Kuroki Takashi, the thing with him is that not much is really known about the dude. Like, even to pinpoint him as the person who did leave together with Komura took a lot of effort, simply because Komura never actually mentioned him by name in the entirety of the interview that he did. Like, I had to go back to like SEDEC, look through all of the people who were there during the presentation, all of the big names in ImageEpoch. I coincidentally found an interview that was done by someone in 108, which was the company that was set up by Komura after he left, and I managed to cross-reference the date such that this was during the period where basically he mentioned that the only people working within the company were just him and the director, and then like this guy was giving an interview about, I think, lots of a million or something. So things just coincidentally all came together in a way that allowed me to figure out that it was even him in the first place. But the thing is, I can't even find the guy on social media now, and there isn't really much information out there about what he did after leaving the company. That said, while there isn't really any information about his whereabouts today, what we do know is that during their stint being homeless working in parks, he did apparently get to work on a fair number of successful titles for Square Enix as well, including Lord of Vermilion, which I guess for that one, it didn't really get out of Japan much since it initially started as an arcade game, which was like, you know, just a system that's mostly dead outside of Japan. And he also did get to work on Blue Dragon, which, not the most successful title, but a title that had a very fairly all-star production team brought on to work on it. So he did get to work with some of the best within the industry quite a fair bit as well. But that said, ever since Earth Wars, there really just hasn't been much information about him, and even within both ImageEpoch as well as 108 story, he has been largely relegated to the position of a footnote, unfortunately. So if any of you know anything about that, do feel free to let me know in the comments down below or something. I'd be glad to learn more about the situation, to be honest, and his whereabouts. Now, lastly, because we've gone through most of the big players within the company at this point, as is Mikage. Most people who talk about this company tend to focus a lot on this guy, and with good reason. He is the founder of the company, and he was the face of the company for most of its time. And the thing with him is that there's probably a lot of information already out there about him, but there's a lot of things that, especially since many of the videos made about him were made a few years back, there has been a lot of development since then. So I'll go through briefly what happened before, and then we'll talk a bit about what has happened since like 6 years ago, when most of the videos have already turned more out of date. So thankfully, he didn't actually end himself or like flee the country at the time. Apparently, what basically happened was that he got so like deep into a negative headspace that he basically became a NEET for a few months. According to him, in an interview he later gave, he apparently had shut himself in for about 3 months, where everyone was basically trying to get him to do the bare minimum to like just maintain himself and not let himself die. So not the best mental state. I can kind of get why, especially after all of the pressure that he had to go through while trying to manage the company in its final years, after seeing this thing that he had built up from scratch be as successful as it was, like, come and end in the way that it did. And he basically stayed in that state for quite a few months before a producer that he was in contact with in the past actually came to him and asked him if he would be interested in creating a game design document and having that in a competition that was going on at the time. He basically submitted it out of like just the boredom of having not much to do, as well as like in spite of the fact that he really felt like he didn't have a chance of winning, and miraculously he won. But even after that, while it did give him a slight boost in confidence, it wasn't really something that was enough to get him back into the industry. And so according to him, after that he basically continued to NEET for a while, but many people actually came to him requesting assistance and like actually giving him compensation with his help in ideation, conceptualization, as well as execution of the projects that they were trying to bring to, I guess, into development at that time, not so much to the market yet. And apparently out of the 4 games that he helped support, 3 of the games actually not only made it out of the ideation phase, but onto the market itself later on. And apparently he was living off of the royalties that he was being provided for having helped to assist with these titles. Unfortunately, according to him, his name was not actually listed on the credits for any of those titles because of the fact that since he wasn't like someone who wanted to go back into the industry yet, he had asked them to also like kind of not put his name on it, and he was quite fine with it not being there for some of the titles where they didn't want his name on it either. So for the most part, most of the titles that he had worked on at this time would just continue to remain unknown. After this, he then got an invitation from the CEO slash IT architect slash system engineer, there's a lot to say in a single breath, of the company Libres, Hodai Ichiro, to actually work as a debugger for some of their games. It was during this time working with them where he finally got back some of the motivation within him to actually try to get back into the industry, and it was thanks to the CEO of Libres that he actually managed to get access to the programmers that he needed, as well as the funds, as the CEO himself was actually willing to help support Mikage's next endeavor. And it is with all of this support that he actually went on to produce his next title, Ancient War Record, or Clan Senki, or Clan Battle Records, I guess as it was known in Japan. That was supposed to be a casual MMO that was up on DMM, that was released in 2018. And that title kind of ended service in 2019. But that said, this title was released through his new company, Mikage LLC. They're naming a company after yourself. Yeah, I guess we do have that with people like Hideo Kojima nowadays, but I don't know, it always struck me as being a little egotistical. But then again, you know, maybe if I was as successful as the two of them, well, maybe I would do the same as well, who knows. After that, he also announced a new game in the Criminal Girls series, you know, that one, the one with all of the you know, as much as I like joke a little bit and riff on it for all of the Guna stuff, and then it was a game that I personally did enjoy quite a fair bit because these systems were actually fairly well designed. Like, I actually did enjoy the way that the dot damage was used within the game as something that would be viably usable for even combating bosses. And if you really wanted to, you could actually use things like poison damage, paralysis in a way to actually fight a fairly fair battle against bosses. So that was something I always found interesting, because I feel like many titles tend to underrepresent the ability to use dot damage, or like it's either overly strong or it's like completely like useless within the game. Or I guess you did have games like Pokemon, which you actually could use it more in a PvP setting, and it wasn't really as useful in PvE, where you're playing against like the main stories, like random trainers, and it, like. But then look, I'm getting like a little sidetracked. Whatever the case, it was a series that was actually fairly decent when it came to the gameplay itself, and that had a plot that was actually quite emotional, as it was mostly a story of like actually redemption and these people coming to terms with like all of the problems that they had in life and trying to figure out how best to move forward and let go of all of the issues that they had, since like there's a lot of like reformation and like reconciliation within the plot itself as well. So the new title that he had planned to release for the series within like I think 2020, he tried to crowdfund the project at the time. The crowdfunding was really successful, and I think it got, like, according to some articles out there, around like 15 million yen or more thereabout. Well, apparently it was a live service game as well, and that game didn't really release on mobile for very long, I think. He did release a beta somewhere along the way, but many people were complaining about how the beta seemed to be of fairly low quality. And well, we do have some like footage on YouTube from other channels of like what the game looks like.
ぺっちゃんこにしちゃおうか。よし、勝負。何もしたかな。大変だったけど楽しかったね。素人でも死ぬ気になればどうにかなるもんね。
Yeah. So apparently the game actually ended servers on the 31st of July 2022. It actually lasted a fair bit longer than the, well, first title that he had released, which only like lasted I think a year. And with this one, it was also kind of strange the way he chose to release it, because I think it initially released through like DL sites, mobile arm or something, so it didn't really release directly onto mobile either, nor on a very mainstream PC site as well. So trying to find information about it was kind of tough. But from the looks of it, the game basically was an on-rail auto shooter, where you basically, instead of like setting the party to like shoot and like cast skills or something, you apparently still had to play during the on-rail segment, where the shooting happens automatically, but you basically had to pick the dialogue choices that pops up on the side window while you're going down the on-rail shooter, and the dialogue choices actually had a time limit on it, kind of like with old Idolmaster, where you had like 5 seconds to respond to dialogue or get fucked by the girls. Not in the way that most of you would actually want to, but more in a oh no, my life is ruined, I'm gonna have to redo the stage sort of way. And that would apparently activate the skills of the characters while the shots were all fired automatically. So I don't know, graphically it feels very dated for a game that released in 2020. Granted, for a live service game, you don't really see 3D like graphics of very high quality very much at the time. And I think the only title that would have come close would be like what, Genshin Impact, when that came out, which would then set a trend for like actually using high quality 3D models within many of these mobile games. Well, I guess you did have something like Honkai Impact 3rd at the time, but yeah, something that was very niche within the industry. So I guess we could kind of justify the weird graphics that this game had chosen for its use of 3D in this like fairly low poly way on console maybe, but for the fact that they had like gotten 17 million in like crowdfunding budget at the time, even the audio within the game at the time sounded very bit compressed and fairly low quality as well. So many things about this new Criminal Girl game felt very low quality in spite of what was promised at the time. And frankly, as someone who actually really enjoyed the first two games, like if you ask me, I would defend the first two like Criminal Girls games as actually being like fairly good and enjoyable games. And I could see them as being games that I would play even without all of the Gunner, like Kuma stuff of the net. Like I enjoyed the plot, I enjoyed the gameplay itself, And I feel like a lot like with Sengoku Runs, these are games that even if you removed all of the adult-ish contents within it, I could still enjoy the game for what it is because I found it fun. Even though with like Criminal Goals, it's more of just an RPG. Personally, I would rather have just seen that than what this mobile game looks like it had become at the time. This was followed by his next title, Arms Armory, which started servers on September 2023 and ended servers in 2024. So about half a year, in fact. It didn't even get to its first year anniversary even. And apparently that game had ended servers as well. So suffice to say, his forays into live service games instead of going back into consumer RPG titles hasn't been the best so far. That said, not much is known about what has happened to him again now so far. Like last I checked, I've even tried reaching out to him as well. He did not reply at all. His company's Japanese Twitter account has been deactivated, and the English Twitter account only really has 2 tweets on it as well, so it's very inactive on both at this point. The Japanese website seems to be just purely a JPEG advertisement for Criminal Goals. It's not even updated for all of the games that came after. And it would seem, looking at the English website for his company as well, it also seems to be fairly outdated, as the last game it actually mentions of having been released is Criminal Goals. And after that, there are just 2 other unpublished games that are listed there as like coming in later years. Looking at the Project AA, I guess, especially when the colors and, you know, the abbreviation AA, Arms Armory, that probably is that title. But if that's true, then that game had basically missed its original target of release by 2021 as stated by his website by a whole 2 years, which I guess then kind of makes sense why it would end service as quickly as it did. Probably because on release, it already had incurred an additional 2 years worth of cost. And with the, I'm guessing, the poor performance of the title at the time, they kind of realized that the writing was on the wall for it, and so they just ended service before it would cause them to incur even more cost in the development. And the next title that is mentioned there, 99 Goals Bullseye, has not been released as of me making this video in December of 2024 so far. So considering the state of disrepair that his site has ended up in, and how most of the social media seems to have kind of fallen into the wayside to some extent in terms of his usage as well, I can kind of get why he didn't actually get back when I tried reaching out to him as well, alongside all of the other people. I mean, it may have to do with the fact that I'm a nobody as well, so that's probably part of the issue. Well, it's nice to see that he's still out there trying to make games and trying to make something successful, even till this day, it would seem. It does seem that he has completely pivoted into trying to make live service games instead of the original like style of consumer games that his company was known for, in spite of the fact that even during the final years of ImageEpoch, it was the mobile game side of things that his company seemed to struggle a lot with as well. Hopefully he learned some stuff throughout all of these like new titles he was developing so that his future titles will be more successful. But for me, I guess part of what feels like it made some of these titles that he had released less successful than they could have been may have also been the decision of where he chose to release the games as well. Like with the whole thing with like his clan war record, for example, the fact that he chose to release it on DMM in 2018 feels like a very questionable decision, right? When we talk about highly successful titles that released on DMM, it's like there hasn't really been anything since 2013 with Kankole, I would say. And it is a platform that does region block people overseas from accessing the game. So in spite of the fact that he has an English website set up and is pushing to advertise so many of his games overseas as well, or I guess the methodology of the release of his titles feels like it kind of undermines the ability for the foreign market that he seems to be appealing to be able to access his games as well. And even within Japan, it's like with DMM and stuff like that, there's a limit to how intensive and how much quality you can put into the game simply because all of it works on a browser. So with that first title, the market of people you're reaching out to is smaller, since you have to download the DMM application on mobile through the DMM website and play the games directly off of DMM instead more often than not, rather than on mobile itself. And so like things are a little more iffy on that end. So accessibility has always been an issue. Even with Criminal Goals X, it's like it's cool that it got all of the marketing that it did, but in the end it's like the methods that he chose to release the game as well just weren't really the best. And when we look at Arms Armory as well, it released on Android and browser on PC, but that also cuts out the entirety of the iPhone market, which apparently they did not reach out to, and there actually are quite a fair number of people within Japan who only use Apple products. So a lot of the methodologies of release do feel like they alienate not just the people within Japan but outside as well, especially with like some of these titles that it just leaves as unpublished on its English website but did release an EOS within Japan within the span of time since then. I don't know, especially when you consider with like Arms Armory releasing in 2023, right? We were talking about a year where you had games like fucking Nikkei, like Blue Archive has been out for a while by this point. And even when you talk about like 2023, that's a year where there's already so much heavy competition in the space of like microtransaction heavy mobile games, right? You have like Reverse 1999, you have Honkai Star Rail, Nikkei was already out the year before, Blue Archive was already quite popular within this period, Brown Dust 2, Aether Gazer, it's like there's already so many games of much higher quality out there in the market. And even if we don't talk about these titles, there are many titles out there of fairly high quality which are already struggling to get by because of the fact that the market has gotten so saturated and the standards of like what players want from games have risen so much that you can't really compete in the market through like the low cost will make like 20 games, let 19 of them fail and hope that one miraculously succeeds, because the era of throwing stuff out on mass just no longer exists anymore, and it's really hard for games which are overly simple and low quality to survive. Right, even when you talk about an EFK game like Memento Mori, for example, it's not low quality. The art is great, the music is great. There's a lot going into it outside of the gameplay that is there to support it, to ensure that it can even reach some level of popularity. So I feel like trying to get into the market in this era, for him at least, feels like it will be a very tough job, because he is fighting a very huge uphill battle against many much bigger companies with much more experience, many of whom are also very much into the patent game, especially within this scene itself. So it's tough trying to actually produce something and hoping that it would succeed, and then hoping that you can operate for another 10 years without getting involved in any lawsuits. I don't know what his next project is gonna be. There is still one more project up on his website that has not released yet. Maybe he's still working on that, and who knows, maybe I'll be proven wrong and that last title isn't a mobile game and he actually moves back into consumer titles at the next point. Or maybe he has already noticed all of this himself and has already decided to shift out of mobile games. We'll have to see. With how things have been going with the company, with all of the way things have shut down, it does leave me a little worried about how the guy is doing. I hope he's doing alright, and hopefully his next title will be one that will be interesting, and we can talk about finally how Mikage has finally actually made a successful comeback. But that's it. This is where we are now with the story of all of the key people involved with the company up till this point. Needless to say, not everyone experienced the same level of success after, and it is quite sad to have seen the company go from slowly rising to some level of success and then crashing and burning the way it did. But it's also interesting looking at all of the key figures and how many of them actually went on to be even more successful, in fact, after their time in ImageEpoch, and how ImageEpoch, in spite of the fact that it didn't become the massive company that I'm guessing many of them hoped it would have become, it did act as a springboard that sent many of its key figures at the time into much more successful positions in much bigger companies, even though arguably many of them were put into very like stressful and tenuous situations after this whole ordeal with ImageEpoch. That said, this brings us to the end of the story of this game company that I feel like many people outside Japan maybe wouldn't even have known existed, simply because of the fact that it was a company that mostly produced games in a genre and in a style that made it fairly niche for its time. There are many people who do enjoy their games, I'm sure, and I hope that this video brought more closure and more understanding of like what happened within the company at the time, and what happened to not just Mikage but all of the key people in the company, and how, while the company itself no longer exists, in a way its influence and its impact on the industry to some extent can still be felt to this day, as many of the big people within it are still working on some very popular titles that exist even till this day, especially when it comes to the stuff made with Type Moon. That said, if you enjoyed this video, do feel free to like and subscribe. I'll be heading off for now as the battery on my camera is really low right now, so thank you to everyone who helps to support the channel. It's thanks to the support you guys give. If you want to support the channel, there's a Patreon. I'll be heading off for now, so until next time, have a belated Christmas and a Happy New Year. Man, this thing really does suck, huh? Take care and bye-bye.